words for today. A little bit of review from last night. I took some elements of our Torah portion, Ki Tetzei, when you go out to war, and I did an extended meditation on how we can look at the several levels of the commandment when you go out to war, and look at ourselves in interpersonal relationship. Why do I focus on interpersonal relationships so much? I'd say probably in the early 2000s up to about 2010, 11, began to just be square with myself and say, for all my teaching of Kabbalah, spiritual psychology, most people suffered the most in their interpersonal relationships. If their interpersonal relationships were squared away, other things went better. Now, not everybody suffered in interpersonal relationships, but just about everybody sometime. And those people who were suffering in their interpersonal relationships, it really affected their inner lives. They actually couldn't get squared away and get on their spiritual journeys because there was so much constant being derailed by the inner life. So as says, Ki Tetzei al oyevecha. So one thing I noticed in my counseling, that people would treat the members of their family as their oyev. Now, not all the time, but occasionally, people go to war against their spouse, their wife, husband, life partner, against their children, children against their parents, and other people. Something happens inside you, and I made a little list of things I would hear. People feel unloved, unseen, unheard, marginalized, devalued, disrespected, and something gets unleashed. Disappointed. You're not getting your needs met. People not doing things your way when you know your way is the right way. And something happens inside of it, and suddenly, for a moment, that other person becomes the oyev. And we treat them as the oyev. And I remember one thing that I say in my counseling practice now and then when people would come in thinking that I do therapy where they get to unload on each other. And I actually use counseling sessions as virtue training sessions. But now and then people made the mistake and thought they were in therapy. And they say, now that I'm in a safe place, I'm going to unleash on my spouse. I said, whoa, wait a minute. I said, you're talking to your spouse, your child, your parent, as if they are the enemy. And they would tell me why. Yeah, because they do this and they don't do this. I said, yeah, I get all that. But treat them as if you love them. Don't talk to them as if they're your enemy. And to take a deep breath and to talk to someone as if you love them. Now, it isn't as if. You are actually doing an as if practice. But it takes you to realize, it's a very immediate hitbonenut practice. I am talking about this person as if they are the enemy. Now, it happens in most relationships. But as we move to the Or the High Holidays, and you want to do a hitbonenut practice, try to remember all the times you talk to someone whom ideally you're supposed to love, and you talk to them as if they are the enemy. And so you ought to not talk as if they are the enemy. And if you can, eventually don't even think that way. The next line is, when you go out to war and you capture a captive woman. And the next little paragraph, if a man has two wives, and ideally this is the wife that was back home guarding hearth and home while he went to war, brought home a foreign captive, married her. And the next one is if a man has two wives, one ahuva and one snua, one hated. And again, I'll say the same thing. A person whom we love, as it were, the person who is ahuv or ahuva becomes the snua, which means that sometimes we go into a very bad place and people detest the other person, and people just devalue and don't respect the other person. And I see it right in front of me. And unlike the momentary unleashing of anger and criticism, which is when you go to war against your enemy, it's more of people hold them in a fixed position of disrespect and disdain. They become the sanui, the person who is disrespected. Now, adolescents have this with their parents, and when I've counseled adolescents, I can see necessarily there is some reduction in affection between adolescents and parents. I think it's part of evolutionary psychology, but they hold their parents in a fixed position of devaluing and disrespect. And what I share to the young person is, if you get used to this, you will transfer that over to people that you love. You will slide right into, I love you, and now I detest you, because your relationship with your parents is your practice for your relationship with other people. That's one of my interpretations of why it says, honor your parents. People say, my parents aren't honorable. I say, you're going to feel that a lot. Not everybody in your life, you're going to feel as honorable, but at least you try to honor them in the way you behave, if not from an inner life perspective. I'll be coming back to that. And the last one of this cycle is if you go to war, you bring home a foreign wife captive, talking to the male warriors, obviously. That one becomes the Isha Sinua. You start to detest her and hate her. By the way, it says you divorce her like a regular person. You don't say, well, I caught her on the battlefield, I'm going to sell her as a slave. No, you can't do that. She's actually an official wife, and you treat her with utmost dignity. You give her a regular divorce, and you set her completely free. No matter how you feel, it's a tragedy, much greater tragedy for her. And the next one is the Ben Sorer Umoret. Now you can see this in our Torah portion. It goes from when you go out to war, take the captive woman, Isha Snua, and then the Ben Sorer Umoret, which is the stubborn and rebellious son. Now, there's a pretty disturbing story that the son disobeys his parents. He's very disrespectful. He's a drunkard and a glutton. He won't take reproof. He won't change his ways. And the Torah says, so take him to the gates of the city, turn him over to the elders, and they stone him to death. Now, the Mishnah and the Talmud hate this, and they try to legislate it out of existence. And if you will go over to the Mishnah on this verse in Talmud Sanhedrin, chapter 8, toward the end, it's almost comical how the rabbis try to say, yes, it's in the Torah, but we're going to make it so difficult to apply the case that you'll never be able to. I talked about it extensively last night. You can go listen to the YouTube. And again, I would hear some parents talk about sometimes their teenage children with utter disdain, disrespect, disregard, a kind of a vile sense that my child is a bad person. They become the Ben Sorer Umored, the stubborn and rebellious son. And by the way, some teenagers are stubborn and rebellious, but it might be because of the conflict in the home. It might be because there is a person who is sanui, who is hated, a person who's devalued, and the kids watch this and they learn those behavioral models. Now, not all the time, maybe not most of the time. I'm not saying that everything people do is from modeling, but good modeling can't hurt, that's for sure. So we parents have to realize everything we say is imprinted on the child. And people say to me, I said it to myself, and people in counseling say, oh my God, I said a lot of things I should never have said. What do? I said, start now, apologize. It takes a couple of years for people, the hologram to change, what people think of us. And you say, I've changed my ways. Change your ways for 2 years straight, and they'll change their opinion of you. People don't change their opinion of you right away because our behavior imprints on them. When I studied the holographic mind, I read one chapter that said, we actually don't see each other. We see holograms of each other that we've created from life experience. And so we actually necessarily, and we can't see everything brand new, we carry holograms. Person says, well, I apologize. Well, you accept my apology. Well, the person might say, I accept your apology, but my brain has a hologram of you and it can't change that quickly. So when people say, I've changed, my wife, husband, child, parent doesn't forgive, it's going to take a couple of years because their heart might forgive you, but holograms take a long time to change. So the parent can see the child as a stubborn and disobedient child, and then pelt the child with words. So again, this is an inner life interpretation of the Ben Sorer Umore, stubborn and rebellious child. Just what spouses do to each other when they hold these others in these moments of disdain and detesting them. The child is pelted with words from the parent, and it really does shame the child. It can kill their spirit. And many children go through their lives working through the trauma of being pelted by stones with parents who held them in a fixed position of being an insufficient human being in some serious way. And so what is the caution to all of us? I'm especially speaking to parents and maybe grandparents of children, and you're watching perhaps your children making the mistakes that you make. Don't hold your child as a ben sorer umoreh, a stubborn and rebellious child. Don't pelt them with their words. There are if you have a troubled child, there are far better ways to handle it than with criticism, complaining, insults, escalating conflict. I mean, I teach them in my parenting classes, and again, as I did last year, I might do a brief version of that as well. So that was my inner life, my inner life application of our parsha. I just wanted to share that with you because it's the kind of a thing when you look at the beginning of Ki Tetzei, there's such vivid imagery, and you can immediately shift it over to our inner lives. One thing I focused on that I want to say a few more words about this morning is the what I'll say the unique case of the nice person. So the world is basically divided between the more aggressive type, the four C's of the criticizing, complaining, condemning, and conflictually oriented. We all have both of them, but there's some people who in certain moments lean more toward the aggressive, and other people lean more toward the defensive, justifying, explaining, defend, denying, trying to give more information. They oftentimes partner with each other. It's kind of a Jungian complementarity. One person a little more aggressive, more interested in power and authority. The other person more interested in freedom and being left alone. In their worst position is power versus freedom. In the best relationships, there's a kind of a collaboration to work out life together. So in any case, sometimes people who are what I'll call not the mostly aggressive type, oftentimes are people who avoid conflict. They win people over by being nice to them, by gaining approval. They're often very patient. They like to justify, explain, defend, deny, try to give more information to an aggressive person. Don't quite understand why that goes so bad, but that's their MO. And so people, by the way, sometimes I call it therapist affect. By the way, many therapists are these people who are run on compassion, concern, kindness, and naturally become good, kind therapists. And then a counselee of mine comes to me and says, I'm so ashamed of myself. I'm a really nice person. I'm a really good person. I said, I know, I've known you for a long time. A volcano interrupted me and things came out of my mouth that I did not know were there. Like this, the volcano came out. And again, so when I quiz the person, oftentimes I'm unseen, unheard, unloved, disrespected, and they try to explain, justify, make their demands in by the book, and it doesn't work, and suddenly the volcano. So for those of you, I'm going to speak to those of you who are the more aggressive type, and you are partnered with the so-called conflict avoidant type. There's a volcano in there, and you've probably already seen it. And that's why the person who says, I'm unloved, I'm unseen, I'm unheard, right, which is a complaint, don't defend yourself. Don't defend yourself. Because if someone says, I'm unseen, unloved, unheard, disrespected, and over here you say, no, you're wrong, right? That can sometimes push a person into volcanic anger because they just had enough of not being regarded in full sufficiency as a human being. Now, for those of us on the more conflict avoidant side, we have to know that if we don't draw kind, clear, firm boundaries, number one, what comes next is depression, because you can't stand the hostility, you can't stand your own anger that's being repressed, and then the volcano erupts. So on both sides, the more aggressive side, the volcano is obvious. On the more defensive side, there's still a volcano, and oftentimes comes out because people just get pushed too far. Now, I mentioned this a bit last night. I want to add one thing to that. When I would counsel people who came in with, my spouse doesn't see me, doesn't hear me, and so forth, if I felt I could get away with a little bit of humor, I said, well, have their hearing checked, have their eyes checked. They go, come on, Rabbi, stop kidding around with me. I said, okay, so don't use metaphors. Tell me exactly what you mean by my spouse doesn't hear me, assuming that their hearing is good, right? They say, oh, okay, don't understand me. Okay? And sometimes when I would do couples counseling, I would say to spouse B, the one who metaphorically doesn't hear, I said, do you understand your spouse? And they would repeat what the spouse says. I said, evidently, your spouse understands you. So when you say they don't hear me, meaning they don't understand, they understand you very well. I said, I would really like you to reach exactly what you mean by doesn't hear me. And I'm going to use this with all of those. I'm not seen, I'm not heard, I'm not loved. I would then quiz the other person. I do see them, I do hear them, I do love them. And now that they get a chance to talk, because I'm enforcing the virtue rules, I look at the other person and say, they evidently do see you, do hear you, do understand you, and they say they love you. Now, oftentimes the person who is in this complaining brain of feeling devalued as a human being, one thing almost all of them say is, I don't believe them. I don't believe them. They're saying the right words, but they don't mean it. Now, the other person experiences this as an insult. Right? It is kind of insulting to say you're lying. You say pretty words, but you don't back it up with meaning. The other person says, but I do mean it. And that's sometimes there's an impasse there. So as a counselor, I say to the person who says you don't mean it, I said, I want you provisionally not to say that. You might be right, because we can't read the darkest chambers of the souls of another human being, and they might be dissembling over here. I read people pretty well. And I think I can read when someone is purely acting. They might be saying the words with some resentment tacked on, but oftentimes what I see is some degree of sincerity. And I look over and say, don't use that word for a while. And I say, not that you're not right, but it doesn't help your own growth as a human being to assign your distress always to an external force. I said, it may be right. It's just not a good habit. You say, what do you mean? I say, maybe there's something in you that is chronically unseen, unheard, unloved. Meaning, regardless of what the other person does, it's not their lack of regard, it's some kind of inner status. Some people call this a shame wound. I think we're either born with it. I think we're all born with the capacity for a shame wound, sometimes severely inflicted by parents, but maybe not. It might just be part of the structure of a personality. So when people say unseen, unheard, sometimes I would, this might sound really too pedantic for you. I would say to the person who claims those things, and again, they might be right. I would say to them, can you tell typically this is spouses, life partners, can you tell them exactly what you want them to do for you to feel seen, heard, loved, respected? Exactly what you want them to do. Almost always, people say, if they loved me, they would know what to do. People get away with that their whole lives until they're in front of a good counselor who says, sorry, that's not what I'm talking about, is you're blaming them again. If you want something from somebody and they may not know how to see, hear, and love, one thing you can do is say, here's exactly what it looks like. And then I say to the offended person, and you don't say it once, because people don't change from one piece of advice. I said, if your spouse chronically doesn't hear you, I said, may I teach you a skill? And look over here. I said, and may I teach you a skill of listening without defensiveness? These are hard things, but the high holidays are coming up. This is, Rosh Hashanah for the Hasidim is Rosh Hashanah, the headwaters of transformation. And many people can't listen to complaints without getting defensive. And if you know that's you, and I think that's probably all of us, except for the hidden saints in the room, that's something to work on. Person over here, if you're the person not heard, can you say it without complaining and putting the other person down? Which means instead of freezing into the extreme positions, can it be collaboration, not enemies, but people on the same side trying to work something out? And I just want to tell you, whenever I've done this kind of couples counseling, there are some people that try and they don't come back, because it's not where everybody gets to unpack. I'm insisting on virtue, and I'm insisting on skills. One person listen in a non-defensive way from now on. I said, do you commit to it? Because if you're not committing to listening in a non-defensive way, I have nothing else to say. I can teach you a skill, but you have to have the vision and the will. Can you see yourself not listening, listening in a non-defensive way? I can see it. Do you have the will? Yes, I'll give you the skills. But if your will is weak, I have nothing to teach but skills, and there might be a better person for you. And I look at the person over here. I said, I know you chronically feel unloved, unseen, unheard. I say, have you learned how to draw kind, clear, firm, and resolute boundaries without getting upset? Sometimes not. They get pushed, and then they explode. That's not good boundary setting. Kind, clear, firm, resolute boundaries and don't get pushed into a corner. That's a skill. They said, well, why do they do it? I said, I'm not talking to them right now. I'm talking to you. Why they do it, we'll talk about that. But you can't keep saying, I don't do what I'm supposed to do because of the way they behave. That's, again, it's a classic fixed position of not changing. We're moving up on Rosh Hashanah, the period of Hishtanu. So the person has to say, if I don't feel seen, if I don't feel heard, if I don't feel respected, and the person over here, at least provisionally, says they want to be that person, I have to become the teacher, not the complainer. Teachers have lesson plans. Teachers are patient. Teachers master pedagogy instead of complaining. And many people, I have to tell them, their whole lives, they're just used to complaining and not actually teaching. Now, I'm offering all of this to you because when I've had people that have said, I say to them, this is the moment. I mean, if you haven't been doing this till now, I say, this is the moment, not where you can do it, but where you're committed to do it. Now, I'm teaching this to you today because I really want us to be able to observe the things happening in our shadow and the feelings of not being heard, not being seen. They're very distrustful parts of us, and they can really infect all of our relationships. That's that inner Amalek that Abigail read about today. We have this nemesis called Amalek. We have an inner Amalek. And who knows, does your spouse, parent not see you, hear you, etc., or is that your inner Amalek that's going to make sure that you always feel unseen, unheard, disrespected, etc.? Is that your Amalek or their Amalek? Versus, how do I know? I said, get rid of yours first. Get yours under control. Isolate yours. Then we can see if it's theirs. But we'll never know what, whose shadow we're working with until somebody decides to, control the wild animals, down in their shadow. Somebody has to go first. So I want to offer that to all of you. In our shadows, there are wild animals. Sometimes it comes out aggressively, sometimes defensively, and sometimes we just get into the habit of blaming other people for how we feel. I think that's evidence of the shadow. So we can, all of us, as we move to Yom HaHishtanu, one very deep practice is, I'm not going to blame my feelings on other people. Now, it's easy to say. You read it in every self-help book in the world, and we're all a little bit behind on that project. And if the other person says, you're right, you busted me. The way I've had people where the person could just actually, I said, can you give an example? One person said, we're out to dinner. I start a story, they finish. I start to say something, they contradict me. I blow up, we get into a fight. I say, thank you. Okay, give me just a solid police report. They do it. I look at the other person, I said, did that happen? Well, not exactly like that. I said, roughly. I said, okay, just sit here for a minute. Your spouse begins stories, you end the stories. They say something, you contradict them. Okay? They try to fit their way conversation edgewise, you unconsciously undermine them. Does that happen enough that your spouse is speaking from authentic pain? Person over here, yes, I see it. I said, so you can own it. And then the question is, the person says, okay, I don't want to be that person. I want to change. Now that's very hard to change because it's very much rooted in a personality style. And personality we're born with, character is what we do with our personalities. But I've seen people say, I see it. I'm ashamed of it, not in debilitating shame, but moral shame. It's a really bad habit and it's hurtful, and I don't want to be that person. So this person has to work on shame. The person over here, I say, now I want to empower you to be a teacher. Well, why do I have to be the teacher? It's my spouse who's the person who's out of line. I say, we're not doing that, right? You'll have to figure out code words. You'll have to learn how to process things that just don't turn into a fight. The spouse breaks bad at dinner. You make a few mental notes. You use the code word, honey. They go, no, and they do their thing. You come home and say, may I point something out to you? Sure. Remember the thing we talked about? Yes. Well, it happened tonight. No, it didn't. Okay. Remember, the first thing we talked about is not refuting everything I say before I say it. Yeah, you're right. I won't say, no, no, I didn't right away. And they say, well, okay, I'll give you her name. Say, yeah, you're kind of right. Say, okay, so I'd like you to work on that. and no volcanoes, no eruptions, no gnashing of teeth or pulling of hair. And people have reported back to me change, right? Rosh Hashanah, the headwaters of Hishtanut, partly because taking responsibility for a situation, even if you are not the cause of the conflict. Now try to imagine, you can be responsible even though you're not the cause. Don't make things worse. Now, here's the last thing I wanted to add to my teaching this morning. Maybe it's a bit disjointed, but for me, there's a through line. And that is in the Torah reading today, discussing Amalek. You know, Amalek attacks from behind and attacks the weak. And it says, Velo Yareh Elohim, and does not have reverence for God, talking about Amalek. So I read it because it's not very clear in the passage who doesn't have reverence for God. Is it the weakened Israelites, or is it Amalek? It's almost certainly Amalek. You'd have to go back to Deuteronomy 25, 17 to 19 to see it. And I thought, what it means is Amalek wins because we are Nechalashim, we are weak because we don't have reverence. Okay. Now, I don't want to blame the victim here, but I want you to think about it for a moment. We also touched on this last night, the idea of God-fearing, that I prefer to call it reverence of the divine. And that doesn't work for many people, the idea of reverence for the divine. And what I said last night, as I've taught many times, reverence for anything. I mean, for example, I revere the Constitution. I revere liberal democracy. I revere civic virtue, which means as citizens, we are both rights endowed and responsibility endowed. And I revere the idea of the citizens' responsibilities for creating, the general welfare. We all can't just be rights-seeking people. We have to be responsibility-seeking people. So, I'm in reverence of Cicero and Seneca, and that I just began studying again this week. The entire natural law tradition, the philosopher Leo Strauss, that he's the one who says that this rights-oriented society cannot sustain itself if it's not matched by civic virtue. So, for example, and this has come across in many of my talks about civility in political discourse, because I revere the liberal state, I revere the idea of the rights endowed person, but we're also responsibility endowed people. So, for example, I revere that. And because I revere it, I automatically teach civility in discourse, and I automatically want to listen to people on the other side, meaning I just know it's the right thing to do. I am morally obligated to do it. Sometimes when I talk to people, they don't revere civic virtue. They don't revere the virtue of the polis, political virtue. What they revere is being right. So I thought about the Israelites. They're weak because lo yareh Elohim. And so just playful, I said to myself, do they have lives of reverence? So this is the last thing I want to say this morning. If you have a life of reverence for relationships, reverence for love, justice, truth, beauty, if you become a disciple of these things, you're strong. And when your inner Amalek comes out and says, say something ugly, you're not going to do it because you revere beauty. Be a false person, make stuff up just to be right. Don't search the truth. Well, but I love the truth. I'm a disciple of the truth. And it says, go ahead and be unloving. They're not very loving, but I'm a disciple of love. I revere the idea, the metaphysical idea of love. So in my playful re-rendering, which I'm liking more and more now that I'm finally saying it, why is Amalek allowed to attack us and hurt us? Because we don't live lives of reverence. And if we live lives of reverence, for example, love, justice, truth, beauty, and the good, the inner Amalek we might be, I'm not saying impervious to the attacks of the inner Amalek, but we are well defended against the gnawing power of the inner Amalek. So therefore, what's the takeaway? What do we have to do as we move toward Rosh Hashanah, the headwaters of Hishtanu? I think a life of reverence is something you have to work on really every single day in a daily practice. What do I revere? I have this system: love, justice, truth, beauty, the good, the holy. I mean, it's embedded in my consciousness. And when I fall out of discipleship, I can feel it. And what I have to do is fall back into discipleship to have the discipline of revering love, justice, truth, and beauty, and let them exert the shinui, let them exert the transformation of my own life.